Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I am your host, Graham Culbertson, and my guest today is none other than the composer of the music that you hear every time you listen to this podcast. It is my friend, David Hill. David, how's it going?
Graham is going wonderful. Thanks so much for having me back. For the second time now, you did not introduce me as your esteemed guest.
Damn it.
So I don't know if I can ever come back for a third time now.
I think you made this exact joke last time and I forgot. And I was just thinking I'll just say that I esteem you, David, but I think I did that last time also. So no
Graham,
esteem.
this aggression will not stand, Graham. I, I just watched The Big Lebowski. I haven't seen it in like a year. It's hilarious. Anyway,
Yeah, the Big Lebowski is definitely a movie. So one of the things I've been thinking, we're already off the rails exactly as we should be. And I do have to record for less than an hour because I have very important basketball to watch in an hour. But I've been thinking because I'm wrapping up the David Graver series. When this comes out, I may or may not be done with it. I don't know, the Debt series. And I've been thinking I want to get more into pop culture and just do like more episodes about pop culture. And man, the Big Lebowski, it would be such a good one to talk about anarchy and nihilism in. I mean, the Big Lebowski is a monster. The dude is obviously an anarchist. Like, it seems pretty clear to me that the dude is a practicing everyday anarchist.
yeah, if you ever get back into that, I'd love to do that one, and also just to talk about the Coen Brothers generally. But that movie especially is just delightful to watch. It's one of like the funniest of their movies, and one of my favorites. And yeah, I think there's like so much stuff that you can kind of bring back to the ideas that are central to what you talk about here.
But the Coen brothers are not anarchists. They believe in a clockwork universe that destroys humanity. They're like determinist, fatalist nihilists, I think.
Yeah, no, even their filmmaking process apparently is it's almost like Alfred Hitchcock, where everything is it's storyboarded and every shot is pre-planned, and like the universe of their films is kind of based on that way of telling stories. But yeah, those guys are incredible. I think they're some of America's best.
Yeah, I've soured on them lately. I can only watch the story of Job unfold through a series of endless tragedies so many times.
It's like they're hitting the same note every film. The one thing I'll say against that is it's definitely it's not a comedy, although there are funny moments in it. But their remake of True Grit, it's definitely their least ironic movie, I feel like, and it has kind of the most like depth in characters, like they're real characters, and it's a real story. And the filmmaking is great. The setting out there on the frontier is wonderful. That one maybe not so connected to the themes of everyday anarchism, but yeah, that one would be a good one as well, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you could talk, these ideas would be interesting about any of their films. I will do a quick shout out to Raising Arizona, which I think it was definitely the first one I saw because it came out in the 80s and I am from the 80s. Although I was not watching Raising Arizona when it came out when I was 4 years old. And I saw it in the 90s. And definitely as I grew older and saw more of their films and some of their darker and more, let's say, like precise films like Barton Fink. I'm a big fan of Barton Fink. I kind of forgot about Raising Arizona as like one of my favorites. And then actually a buddy of mine, somebody for his birthday, this is about a decade ago, they screened Raising Arizona at a local theater in Regent Square in Pittsburgh. And I went and saw Raising Arizona on the big screen for the first time. And I was blown away by how good it was. And it just like brought tears to my eyes nonstop.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any of their films in a theater, but that would be a great one to see, to have the audience with you and kind of reacting to things stuff.
Yeah, and I was there, we were there. Clint, it was his favorite film. Also, someone had brought a keg of IPA. So, we enjoyed it. Um,
So wait, to link this back to Nietzsche, to the Coen brothers.
oh, definitely.
So he so Nietzsche, he says in this book that only excess of strength is proof of strength. And he says also that like excess of life is kind of the definition of what he thinks of as Dionysian. And my favorite scene in any Coen Brothers movie is the Tommy gun sequence in Miller's Crossing. I don't know. Do you remember that scene?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
it's just so excessive and over the top and beautiful and hilarious that yeah, I think Nietzsche, if he had seen that, he'd probably enjoy it.
okay. So this is actually we're that's so perfect. That the Tommy gun scene, Gabriel Byrne. So here's the thing, David. So for my listeners who are not obsessed with the Coen Brothers, and that's, I don't know if that's a good. I recommend being obsessed with the Coen Brothers. Certainly, I was for decades. We're gonna turn it back to Nietzsche, and here's the thing about Nietzsche. So David picked this book, Twilight of the Idols, which I had actually never read, and I am a huge fan of Nietzsche. If you listen to the show, you know that I love Emerson, and traditionally, anarchists stress the influence of this German individual anarchist named Max Stirner on Nietzsche. But Stirner, along with Schopenhauer, are these German philosophers who had a major influence on Nietzsche, and then Wagner, probably the greatest influence. And all three of them, by the end of his life, he disowned and argued against and kind of made fun of. The one person who he never says anything negative about, the person he most consistently praises throughout his entire career, is Ralph Waldo Emerson. I mean, Nietzsche is an Emersonian. And if you listen to this show, you know that I think that Emerson is the center of intellectual anarchism. And in Kropotkin's listing of all the people who are anarchists, even if they weren't part of the movement, at the very end of his encyclopedia entry, he lists both Nietzsche and Emerson. And then the famous German anarchist Landauer, who's a big fan of Kropotkin's, translated him into German, and also was a big fan of Nietzsche's. I mean, he views Nietzsche as compatible with anarchism. But sorry, this is a long intro, but we'll get to David in a second and Twilight of the Idols. And Nietzsche is just a figure who people are terrified of. Now, growing up, my parents were terrified of him because he said God was dead. So that was bad, and I couldn't read him. But really, people are terrified of Nietzsche because he seems to be kind of a fascist. Nietzsche says a lot of things horrible about women. He says horrible things about Christianity. He seems to say horrible things about Jewish people, but actually, if you read more closely, he actually doesn't hate Jews. He hates Christians, and he associates Jews with Christians, but he thinks Jews are better than Christians. It's quite funny, and so there's this like bad image of Nietzsche as a proto-fascist that was encouraged by the Nazis. And I'm always trying to explain to people that when you read the gay science and when you read, I'm blanking on it now, the one that everyone reads, the most famous one, not Zarathustra.
Genealogy of Morality.
Yeah, Genealogy of Morality. When you read these, you realize that everything that people say this Nietzsche guy loves, that's kind of fascist, he actually hates all of that stuff. And then you give me goddamn Twilight of the Idols, David, and Nietzsche's like, war is great, and I love war, and you know what I hate? Women. And so I've been telling people for 20 years now that Nietzsche's not the fascist you think he is. And then I read this book, and I was like, damn it. David Hill made me talk about a fascist thinker on my anarchist show. So why did you defend yourself, David?
All right. So first off, this is absolutely my favorite of Nietzsche's books that I've read. I've read a good amount of them, but I have not read all of them. And by the way, like I don't really know like the full history of this, but apparently after he died, or I think even when he was still alive and starting to lose his mind, his older sister kind of took control of his writings and how they were edited and published. And I think that she was very much sympathetic to what was going on politically in Germany. And even in this book, like Nietzsche, he said he uses the phrase the German Reich, and he doesn't have anything good to say about it.
No, he hates the Reich so much.
It's in a state of decline, according to him, at that point. And yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There are things in this book that you could say that they've aged terribly. His attitudes towards women, towards Englishmen, towards cows. all these things.
Okay, I will defend cows, but the shots towards Englishmen are just great.
And by the way, like the other thing that I found interesting is he has this. It's not in this book, but he has this aphorism where he says, "If you're going with a woman, bring the whip." And people use this to say like this is you should brutally oppress women with physical force. There's a picture of him and one of his friends with this woman. Oh, her name escapes me. Maybe Lou
Yeah,
Salone or
I know
something
who
like
you're
that.
talking about. I can't remember though.
And
Yeah,
it's a picture of him and his friend, and Lou Salone, the woman, has the whip, and
yeah.
she's kind of dictating where with the direction that they're going. So one of my friends said, "This is like you bring the whip when you go to see a woman because you give it to her, and she's the one who calls the shots." Maybe this is like a little bit too enthusiastic of a defense or a
No,
rationalization for Nietzsche, for what Nietzsche says about women in books like this. But no, it's important to mention and talk about, and it's definitely going to be linked up with some of the ideas that we'll probably discuss. Um, but yeah, just to get back to why I really like this book, one of the reasons why,
actually, no. Let me jump in before you get to that. Just
yeah,
say this. This is the problem with Nietzsche. So in the introduction, I forgot who wrote the introduction to the edition we have. He mentions that Nietzsche says two totally contradictory things about happiness, and then he says actually what Nietzsche is doing is he means one thing when he uses this word in this aphorism, and he means the exact opposite thing when he uses this word in this later aphorism. And I'm not saying that's not true, but that's just when you are reading Nietzsche, he is so frequently ironic and confusing and turns his things around that there's this statement like when you go with a woman, bring the whip, and it really obviously means that you're going to whip the woman because you're a patriarchal monster. And it also seems to suggest that you secretly want to be dominated and the greatest force is to lay the whip aside. And I think Nietzsche maybe means both of those things. And that's why more sober minded philosophers are just like, this guy, you don't even, when he says the word happiness, he may mean the exact opposite thing as when he uses the word happiness 3 pages later. So I find him thrilling, but, and we're not going to solve this in this hour long podcast. You can't resolve the contradictions of Nietzsche. And I think the fascist Nietzsche and the anarchist Nietzsche are in some ways both true. And I know that's like a cop out, like a both sides cop out, but it's amazing because I really want, Nietzsche's brilliant and I love reading him. And then I just read these passages and I don't want to just say like, oh, well, when he says use strength, he actually means weak. I don't know. I don't know, man. I'm sorry. I'll let you get back to it, but I had to say that.
no, this is really important because like, and I think this kind of comes back to his writing style and using the aphorisms and the epigrams. Is that like it's so easy to quote him out of context, and a lot of like pretty much everything that he writes in this book, it's all he always comes back to the human body and to physiology, and he's talking about strength and weakness and decline and ascendancy of culture and ideas, and it always comes back to biology. And you get a sense that if you were, a Nazi who wanted to appropriate his ideas, it would be really easy to do so. And there's a lot that you can, conveniently take out of context, even, whole large passages, and still use that to, dehumanize people and to kind of bring in like these ideas of race and, whatever it is to further some kind of fascist agenda. And I think that's it's one of the difficulties of reading him. And what I take away from what you just said is that you do have to approach him with kind of like an openness and a sort of skepticism that you're out of doors to his irony and to like
Yeah.
how sophisticated his writing is. But all that's just to say that he's definitely not like a one dimensional thinker and writer. And there's just I don't know. That's kind of how I approach him anyway. But yeah, just to kind of quickly answer your question, my favorite things about reading him are his thoughts about art and his thoughts about history and historiography, and we'll probably get to that when we kind of get into the book. But he just has this ability to like I learned to study history through the methods old and new that are referred to as historicism, and I think Nietzsche would find that method laughable in a lot of ways. And but he does such a great job of showing how you have to use you need to bring your intellect, your creativity, and empathy to the table to really try as best as you can to get into the shoes of these people and these periods, and to estimate what the values were and what the, the activity of these people, what was guiding it, and to kind of get like a, a provisional and an imperfect feel of a historical place or person. But just like that, the forcefulness with which he kind of enters into that, and then just the style of his writing, and the clarity, the grace, the irony. That's kind of, and I guess just his writing style. And he talks about, the importance of teaching writing and thinking, and teaching thinking as a form of dancing, and dancing with the pen when he's talking about teaching writing. And those are kind of the things that I always return to with him. And I also love that my own beliefs, even, from a younger man, when I first encountered his books to now, I feel like I'm always being challenged in a productive way, and in a way that encourages me to become, a better thinker myself, and to become more creative. So that's kind of what I really admire and like about his work.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense. I'm gonna let you start us off in just a second with what parts of the book we should actually talk about, but I want to give another example of this. So, the New York Review Books Classics publishes this. They published this really great, I think, pretty early volume of Nietzsche called like Anti-Education. And when I was, quitting my job at the school that we both worked at, well, you had already quit your job correctly, wisely quit your job a year before. Um, I was reading everything I could about what was horrible about the education system, and I was reading Nietzsche's Anti-Education, and it was just so good, and I was loving it so much. And then I got to this part where he's like, when you're teaching writing, you shouldn't give the students any individual choice at all. You should just force them to write in the like classical style, and there should be no freedom in writing. And I was just shocked. That's not a direct quote because I read that book 5 years ago, but it's something roughly like that. And I was just shocked. I was just astonished that I've been agreeing so much with him, and then suddenly he says the thing that's the antithesis of my way of teaching. And then he says something like, honestly, really all you want is your students to have their own style and write totally freely without restraint, but that's really hard to do. So force them to write in this other style and don't give them any choice, and then that will give them the chance to develop their own style or something like that. And I was like, wait, Nietzsche, you're arguing that because it's so important that students be given freedom to write, you shouldn't give students freedom to write. And I just, I don't, that's just, he's so tricky. He's so tricky.
Yeah, he really is. And by the way, speaking of the place where you and I both were employed, I once talked to our colleague there, and we were talking about this a passage in this book about liberal institutions, and we were talking about the educational institution, and his quote about the in liberal institutions, the herd animal triumphs with them every time. And,
Yes.
and my colleague was like, "It's so true."
I know. Look, and actually, this is a wider thing. I know I've talked about this with Cory Doctorow on this podcast a couple of times. The problem of like, I talked about this with Yanis Varoufakis in terms of like, what's his name? Steve Bannon is running around using the word techno feudalism. Like, so many of the critiques of the liberal institutions that I hear in the mouths of fascists, like there's a right wing student magazine at the institution that I work at now, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was considering keeping it secret, but everyone knows I work at UNC. It's in like my bio. So, and it has quotes from Nietzsche in it all the time. And so these people who see the other guy that I think of a lot of times is the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, whose critiques of liberal institutions are just so on point. And I'm just nodding along and I'm like, yes, Ross, you're so right. And he's like, and that's why we should have conservative Catholicism run the country. And I'm like, what?
Was not expecting that. That guy do that. He had Bannon on for his podcast.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting stuff though, and I mean, like you can take issue with a lot of it and where it's coming from, but at the same time, like you said, like it's the same criticisms that you would voice, but then you have, this other thing coming after it, or it's nested in this thing that you kind of disagree with.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the very least, though, I think it's good that like those conversations are out there, because they both acknowledge that like it's a New York Times podcast. Like the audience probably hates them both, but at least the ideas are out there.
Yeah. All right. So, yes, we've already brought up one thing, which is I too marked that passage on liberal institutions, and I was just like, yes, every school, every workplace. Yeah, I got that. So, what else should we talk about? What is the Twilight of the Island? Oh, I the subtitle of this book is How to Philosophize with a Hammer,
Mhm.
and I always thought it was this totally like simplistic thing that he was going to smash the idols, but actually he's tapping them gently and holding his ear up to them and seeing if they are hollow. He's
he's,
not
sounding,
smashing Christianity. It sounds a little off. It sounds off.
he's sounding it as with a tuning fork. And this is it's the most funny thing to me. He says, oh yeah, wait, here we go. Okay. For once to pose questions here with a hammer, and perhaps to receive for answers that famous hollow sound which speaks of inflated bowels.
Yeah. So yeah, there's something he says. I guess that Western civilization is constipated. Is that what that
Yeah,
joke
I
is
mean, I
there?
assume that's what he meant. But no, this is a great place to start. I think that, and this is one of my favorite things about the book, this intro, where this reminds me of just any well-meaning person. Like, we taught together. This reminds me of you in the classroom. This first line, to stay cheerful when involved in a gloomy and exceedingly responsible business is no inconsiderable art. Yet, what could be more necessary than cheerfulness? And he like opens the book with focusing on this wonderful thing that's
Yeah.
very important for all humans, and then like within a page he's like, this book is a grand declaration of war. And he's just all over the map, and yeah, that's what I really like about it. But yeah, maybe to get started, I know you probably have a lot of things in here that you wanted to talk about. We got some limited time, so were there any like favorite things that you really wanted to get into from the book?
Well, the only thing that I wanted to make sure that we covered is that he does talk about anarchists in this book, and he has one really good line in an aphorism that's like, "It's so good, it's the classic like." The reversal thing, like my mentor John McGowan used to always say that when someone says of course, which sounds like that means that obviously everyone knows that, but actually people put of course right before a claim that they're really nervous about, and they're trying to like carry you along. Well, one of the things he says about this is like, how do you know like that a prince is a prince? It's because an anarchist is trying to shoot him. That's like, we would like to think that the anarchists, at least the anarchist assassins. Actually, Graeber talks about this. Okay, I'll do this a little bit longer. Anarchist assassins, we like to think that they are like against the czar, but actually anarchist assassins are totally like, they're in like the same swirling maelstrom as the czar. Like, if you wake up and you think there's a lot of bad stuff in this country and it all comes from that one figurehead at the center, and if I shoot him things will be good. Well, that guy wakes up and he thinks there's a lot of great stuff in this country, and it all comes from me. I'm the czar, and all I got to do is kill those anarchists on the periphery who want to kill me, and everything will be good. So actually, I think Nietzsche's right. Like, the czar and the czar assassin are kind of enmeshed in the same thing. And so a more everyday anarchism that is like, man, I don't care about the czar, but I am going to grow some green beans and share them with my neighbor. I think that feels, I don't think Nietzsche would make this like pleasant garden metaphor. That's my addition, or like Kropotkin's. But this idea that like the anarchist and the prince are, they're not opposed to one another like they think they are. They're yin and yang. They're swirling together. I think that's true.
Yeah, and I can see, he in some ways, when you're reading this book, it's like he's trying to provide like a glimpse of his thought at its peak, at its height, and he needs to be forceful and hard and tough. But I mean, in his everyday dealings, I was reading that Sue, I think her name's Sue Prideaux, biography of him. He was like, super like calm, quiet, exceedingly, proper and courteous and nice. And I can see him stumbling across a community garden and looking at it and being like, I'm all for
Yeah.
this. I like this a lot. He wouldn't say that in this book though. And kind of coming back to your idea of like the the prince and the czar are sort of locked into this struggle that they both have an equal part in it, and it's a misunderstanding of both of them. Um, I feel like hmm, I don't know where I was going to go with that thought. I was trying to link it up to something, but
And we can come back to it if it comes to mind. So what do you like about this book? What makes this
oh,
book great to you?
so yeah, I mean, all the things that I mentioned before, that I love, like the historiography, the thoughts about music and art and where art comes from. The link with Emerson, I really love that aphorism. I think it's wonderful. And yeah, so I guess maybe since you were talking about the like when he actually mentions anarchism, and I know you were saying before like he lumps it in with socialism, and I didn't look too much into it, but the guy Landauer that kind of spurred our discussion, who was an anarchist and used Nietzsche as a way to kind of prop up his own thinking and to, I guess, figure out what his thoughts were about politics and all that kind of stuff. It seems like he, and again, you can kind of correct me here if because I'm sure that you know this a lot better than me. He liked all this stuff in here, like sounding out idols and critiquing culture and religion and how these things are a negative force in society and on the individual. But he couldn't go along with this like really kind of extreme form of individualism and will to power and one individual like triumphing over others in this like excessively competitive way, which Nietzsche is all about. Is that kind of like how you understand what his relationship to Nietzsche was?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no Landauer expert, but I would say, I mean, taking Landauer and then going further, like what I always would say to the students is like Nietzsche is a solvent. Whatever you turn him towards, he's going to dissolve. And there's that famous biography of him that's a slightly more forceful metaphor called "I Am Become Dynamite."
Hmm.
Like, it just seems like Nietzsche is really good at showing the hypocrisy and I mean, downright, you might even say like evil, the like evil baked in to every uh ideology and system. There's a famous Walter Benjamin quote that's something like every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism, and I would think that's a very Nietzschean idea. So the sort of like positive Nietzsche, like when Nietzsche says what he wants in the world, sometimes that seems great and what he wants is joy, and sometimes that seems terrible and what he wants is war. So like the what Nietzsche wants, I could see for any anarchist wanting only part of what he wants. But when he looks at something and he's like, I'm going to explain to you where this comes from, what urge it springs from, and what's really dark and evil and wrong about wanting that thing, I think that's right, actually. And so when he critiques the anarchists, I mean, I think that's right about everything, because I think Benjamin is right that anything that exists that is good is also the document of something that is bad, the bad workshop. You know, Nietzsche says in Genealogy of Morals, like, come into the workshop where morality is made. You know, it's disgusting. You're not going to like it. And he's lumping the anarchists in with the socialists, the Democrats, and really everyone who wants to get rid of inequality. And something that Graeber sort of turned towards the very end of his career, especially in that uh, last book that he wrote before he died, the Dawn of Everything with David Wingro, was he sort of turned against the idea of fighting for equality, and instead of something like liberty. And I think in the same way as that sort of like metaphor of the anarchist trying to kill the prince or trying to kill the czar, inequality does seem to spring, as Nietzsche says, from ressentiment. If you wake up and you think, I am unfree, I don't have enough, I need to have enough to live. I'm not being who I want to be. I'm not flourishing as I could. That seems reasonable. But if you wake up and you're just pissed off because someone has more than you, that's dumb and wrong. And so a world in which billionaires exist and people are starving is bad. But it's bad because people are starving and because billionaires are enslaving people. It's not bad because someone has more than someone else. Someone's always going to have more than someone else, and just nobody needs that much. And the problem isn't inequality. Inequality is not the problem. And it springs from, Nietzsche thinks, jealousy and resentment and envy. And so when you say, I want to tax the billionaires, Nietzsche thinks actually what you're saying is, I'm sad I'm not a billionaire. And so you're actually not against the billionaires. You're pro billionaires secretly deep down.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this. I did not know. I haven't read too much Graeber, but the fact that it's a turn away from thinking about it and like building a community based on addressing inequality versus building a community based on affirming liberty. And yeah, maybe we can go to that passage where Nietzsche defines, what freedom is to him. But I did want to come back. I wanted to. I already, we already talked about this. I watched or I listened to a separate podcast that you did with a scholar on ancient Greek games,
Yeah.
and you guys talked a lot about Agon, and I loved it. It was phenomenal, and it links up really nicely with this text. And just coming back quickly to your mention of envy, I shared with you the Nietzsche article from earlier in his career, Homer's Contest. I don't know if you had a
Mhm.
chance to check it out.
I
Um,
did not. Well, I read like half of it, but I can't speak to it well on the podcast.
so yeah, I probably can't either. I mean, even though it's early, like it's still tough, and obviously it's translated from German into English. But he talks about there's this Horace ode where envy is defined in two separate ways, and the one way is like you envy someone else, like the person who envies the billionaire, and it just kind of leads to yourself, feeling down and resigned and not wanting to fight for a better life for yourself. And then there's this other kind of envy where you don't feel that way at all. You want to become better than your opponent, but there's still kind of this respect for your opponent and a respect for the game, whatever the game is, whether it's like a festival where playwrights are competing, or if it's a sports match, or if it's like verbal sparring or whatever it is. And that's kind of like the good envy, and one that I think Nietzsche would link up to liberty and his idea of freedom. But all the same, like maybe this metaphor or this idea from Graeber with the equality versus liberty and building a community and kind of creating like consensus among a group, we can go back to the ancient Greek festival that you talked about with that scholar, because it is, a fiercely competitive business to, whether you're doing like Olympic sport or you're Sophocles writing literature at that level and having it, performed and being taken part of this competition. um that it is like a dog eat dog sort of thing, the actual competition, but it is nested in this festival where the entire community is there, right? And maybe that could be kind of like a way we check out this passage on freedom.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because it's a democratic festival. So listeners know I've been doing a lot of work related to Teen Nguyen, who was on the podcast and also was on the games podcast, Plumbing Game Studies, and his one of his biggest concepts is this idea of striving play, where all you want to do is play. You don't actually care about winning. But in order to play, you have to try and win. Like if you play a game of chess and you just move your king out to be mated immediately, and you're like, "Oh, I don't care about winning. I just want to play." It's like, no, you have to be trying to win in order to play. But ultimately, what's at stake is like the thrill of playing. And so when people talk about the educational system as a level playing field, or, the economy as a competition, then those people, they don't care about playing at all. They only care about winning. And actually they've ruined winning, and they're just giving their like stupid kids billions of dollars, and they're like, "Look, my kid is such a winner." But actually there was no competition, there was no real competition at all. So a democratic festival in which everyone has enough, except for, obviously, I have to always mention, all of the people who have been enslaved, and the empire the Athenians ran that was just a total empire of conquest, and the women who were not full participants in this. But within that, you know relatively large portion of the population that counted as a citizen in Athens, I think it was pretty free and open. Everyone had enough food, and everyone was invited to compete to be a wrestler or a poet. And winning was of desperate importance. But like right now, in the meritocracy, if you're a winner, you have a house, and if you're a loser, you starve and die. In Athens, all you got for being a winner, David Potter, I'm sure, could give a more nuanced version of this, but mostly what you got for being a winner was that everyone thought it was cool that you were a winner. Like, remove the competition from the suffering and the inequality, and all of a sudden competition becomes thrilling and powerful. And it does sound like when Nietzsche's like, yeah, war is great, if by war he means a war of seeing who can write the best play, that does sound pretty awesome to me, but not the war that meant the Athenians are going to go enslave people. That's the bad kind of war.
Yeah, I was gonna link up with the last thing you said about like what is actually won. You get kind of like bragging rights, and you get props from all the other people that were involved in the game and the audience. And I was gonna say, but no, Sophocles won for himself immortality as one of the best Western playwrights ever. But I don't know if it was Sophocles or one of the other guys, but apparently on his gravestone, he didn't mention at all that he was a playwright. He just
Yeah.
mentioned that he fought bravely at the Battle of Marathon.
Yeah.
Was it Sophocles?
I don't remember, but this is really undercutting my theory that, like, this is at least undercutting my reading of Nietzsche, that it's about the play war that really matters. Um,
But no,
yeah.
the other thing like that I always, whenever I think about this idea, I always come back to this. Like, I mean, there's certainly lots of things that we could read to give us a better picture of this. Like Nietzsche mentions his mentor and friend Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote a book on like the history of ancient Greece, and like there's probably so much writing and so much information out there. But I've always been curious, like those competitions with the playwrights, how is it actually decided? Like a playwright, like performing a series of plays is not a wrestling match. Like it probably takes multiple days to get that done, or maybe at least a single day. And are they basing it on like some judges who are just looking at the play? Are they considering the audience's reaction? Are they wandering around the festival in between plays and kind of overhearing, what the audience is saying?
Yeah, so this is definitely a David Potter question. I don't know the answer, but from what I know about Athenian democracy, I would guess that the audience got to vote, because the Athenians didn't do the nonsense we do. The, like, everyone gets to vote, and they vote for a representative, and then that representative is temporary king and can just deport whoever he wants to. They didn't do that, and they didn't, like, do direct democracy in the sense that everyone votes for a referendum, the, like, California thing, because that was silly and no one has time for that. But it was like, if you showed up that day, you got to vote. And I'm guessing it was like, look, this is a commitment. You have to sit through all these plays. Maybe you would rather be at the wrestling matches. I understand. But anyone who comes and sits through all the plays gets to vote. That would be my guess. I am really speaking about something that I am totally ignorant of. So I should stop
Yeah.
talking.
No, that I imagine like if you're not correct, there's probably some truth to that explanation of it. But yeah, maybe you can send Potter an email on my behalf.
Yeah. Hey,
How
buddy.
exactly were these competitions won?
Yeah.
But to come back to in a way that doesn't undercut your point about play, but kind of affirms it. I also think like on a maybe this is more of a personal level, and obviously we'll never know with Nietzsche because he's dead. But I feel like he seems to despise Socrates and Plato. But he's in the tradition of philosophy. He's a philosopher just like them, even though he disagrees with them. And he comes very late to the game in writing about all this stuff. But I wonder, like Nietzsche's feeling of just excess of energy and cheerfulness after having written some of these passages and just sitting down. I forget which Italian city he was in at sunset after a day of writing, and just feeling like that own personal triumph of just being part of the game. There's no one else there to kind of participate in that with him, but of that being like the kernel of the positive kind of stakes of the game that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that makes sense, but I would say he does also want to destroy them. But it's because they claim that philosophy has no room for joy, for excess, and I think, if I'm going to be so forgiving to this Nietzsche, who I love so much, even though I find him so frustrating, when he sings the praises of war, uh this is bad and wrong, and war is bad, but he's definitely opposing it to like the man in the gray flannel suit, Christian liberal technocratic society of just endless bureaucrats and technocrats worrying about factories and making bread in factories instead of in bakeries, which we talked about with Adorno as well. And in that sense, I get when Kant is like, look, you have to read 10,000 pages of reasoning that makes no sense, and when I'm done I'll just explain that Christian morals were right all along. The calling for, and Plato does the same thing. I mean, this is his critique: is these people want a dead universe, and the thing that they call their dead universe is life. And so Nietzsche calls the thing he opposes to that war. Well, sometimes he calls it life, and sometimes he calls it war. And if we're playing that game that the guy who wrote the introduction to this book is playing it, Michael Tanner, then when he says war, he doesn't mean war, he means life. And life should be the opposite of war. But since Kant and Plato call their dead thing that is actually a war on the soul, they call it life. So his war on that is called war, and he actually means affirmation and joy. That's the game you got to play if you're gonna buy into this book. But I don't know. Apparently, I just did, but I'm not buying it.
Yeah, I I also think like I really admire Nietzsche as a stylist, as I've probably repeated a few times here, and I said the same thing about Adorno too when we were talking about him. And I feel like I'm at a great loss in not knowing German,
Yeah,
and reading him in English translation. There's so many. It's not just those words that are ambiguous and have multiple meanings, and they're the same word, but just all the I don't know, like irony in itself is infinitely difficult, even if it's in English and that's your native language. But then that kind of add this whole another layer onto it. But yeah, maybe I'll read the passage where he defines freedom,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
can.
This will be like the last thing we do because we just keep talking. So yeah, give us freedom. This will be our first and last thing we do.
All right, here we go. So this is I don't know if you got your edition, but it's 103, and this is who's the translator? Hollingdale. Yeah, R.J. Hollingdale.
Yeah,
So
my
this is
conception of freedom. I've got it. Go for it, Professor Hill.
so this is kind of towards the bottom after he was bad mouthing liberal institutions. I guess I'll skim through a little bit of it at the top. Um, okay, the value of a thing sometimes lies not in what one attains with it, but in what one pays for it, what it cost us. And the example is liberal institutions. These immediately cease to be liberal as soon as they are attained. Subsequently, there is nothing more thoroughly harmful to freedom than liberal institutions. He says that it's the herd animal which triumphs with them every time. Liberal institutions are reduction to the herd animal. And then at the bottom here, he says, he brings up war. Viewed more closely, it is war which produces these effects. War for liberal institutions, which as war permits the illiberal instincts to endure. And war is a training in freedom, for what is freedom? That one has the will to self responsibility, that one preserves the distance which divides us, that one has become more indifferent to hardship, toil, privation, even to life, that one is ready to sacrifice men to one's cause, oneself not accepted. Freedom means that the manly instincts that delight in war and victory have gained have gained mastery over the other instincts. For example, over the instinct for happiness, which is in quotes. The man who has become free, and how much more the mind that has become free, spurns the contemptible sort of well being dreamed of by shopkeepers, Christians, cows, women, Englishmen, and other Democrats. The free man is a warrior. I can't help but just laugh at it. Um, the Englishman is kind of what gets me. But yeah. So I mean, he says respect for the distances that divides us. That's the opposite, right? Of anarchism, of
Yeah,
Bauer and Kropotkin and Graeber, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. And yeah, I mean, look, this passage is perfect. This is actually probably the one that I flagged most strongly too, besides the one where he mentions anarchists itself. And yeah, I also don't read German, but I did go to the German and Project Gutenberg just to make sure that he was using the word anarchist. That wasn't like a translation thing, but yeah, it's anarchisten. So yeah, I think that's good.
Anarchist.
Uh, I think we can call that. I think anarchist and anarchistin are probably the same word. Yeah, when he's talking about it's the war for liberal institutions, which is to say, when people defend liberal institutions, if I'm understanding this correctly, they do illiberal things. I mean, this is the basic justification. Everything that the anarchists hate about the government, all of the violence, the military, the passports, the deportations. If you ask liberals, why do you have these things? Aren't they illiberal? And the liberals say, oh, we have to have these things to, otherwise we're not liberal. Anyone can do whatever they want unless we're checking their passports at the border. And it's like, right, but that you, but in the name of freedom, you're checking everyone's passports and putting kids in cages. Why? So that first part of that paragraph where Nietzsche is like, yeah, if you let liberal institutions go, the first thing they do is make war on freedom in defense of themselves, and they are the antithesis of their own stated values. I always claim that anarchists are out liberaling the liberal because the liberals are like, we must have bureaucracy and violence in order to have freedom and safety. And I'm like, what? No, no, you don't get peace with a Department of War, and if you rename it the Department of Defense, it's still not a peaceful department. And so I'm just nodding along, yes, Nietzsche, and then he's like, and war is good, and I hate cows and women, and Democrats. Man, I don't know, I don't know.
And even though all these words, especially Democrats and liberals, these have different meanings in this time period in this country, but there is continuity, right? And
I think when he says Democrat and liberal, I think there's pretty good continuity. I think Englishmen and cows, there's probably less continuity. And then, but I think women, I don't know. I mean, I had long conversations with friends in grad school. There was one woman who was just like, she said basically a version of what you said with like the whip is like when he's attacking women, he's actually overcoming himself and disciplining himself, and he doesn't mean what it seems to mean. And I don't know. I read this and I'm just like, seems like maybe this guy just hates women, and that's not good.
yeah, it is not good to hate women, by the way. I just want to clarify.
Yeah, but the question is whether Nietzsche hates women, and it's just like it seems obvious that he does, and yet everyone's always got some silly story about the whip and how actually he doesn't hate women.
It's true. So I'm probably going to do all kinds of contortions and twists to rationalize my love of Nietzsche here and just completely disregard your question of whether or not he hates or loves women.
Okay, go for it.
But all right, so here's my thing and why I love this and why I kind of link it back to Emerson. And I was again, that biography that mentions that he read The Conduct of Life, which is a late book of essays by Emerson when he was 17. And I imagine he probably read a lot of Emerson. I don't know in which language he read him. He apparently read Dostoevsky for the first time in French. I have no idea what languages Emerson was even translated into. But yeah, for here, I think. Do you remember? You may not. We were teaching Emerson, I think Nietzsche, and the students were asking us, so what is the transparent eyeball? And you were explaining to them what it was, and we had this conversation about how this is like an elevated state of awareness and kind of unity with the natural world that you can't really sustain. It's just not possible. Like you have these epiphanies and these moments of yourself on the heights, but then you come back to everyday life, and it's unavoidable. And that's kind of the way. And again, like I'm kind of excusing and not addressing the stuff in here that's reprehensible, but that's kind of how I feel about this. Like I can't I can't do battle with every person that I meet every day that I have a disagreement with. I can't always be in a state of war or aggression or opposition. At the same time, though, I think that having that mindset can be beneficial in different ways. And I also kind of appreciate like the wit here too. Like, do you remember when he's criticizing Socrates' dialectic, where he's saying like to have reasons for everything, it's pathetic. That's not noble. That's not noble taste. And then he says it's indecent to display all of one's goods. And he's like, you don't have to give reasons, you just have to command.
Yeah.
And again, like, you can't be tough all the time. And you have to be all the other things, especially if like you're a father or a teacher or all these these different roles that you have to play throughout your life, right? But I kind of, whenever I come back to Nietzsche and passages like this, I just think about like certain passages in the Iliad, which is a book of ruthless, brutal warfare. But also, like, I'm reading a prose translation of it now. There's also, like, it comes back to like respect for the game and for contests and for agon and all that other stuff, and how that's a basis for society. I feel like competitiveness gets a bad rap in a lot of ways, and in a lot of justifiable ways, when you're thinking about economies and issues that you come back to on your podcast. But I think that, like, combining the warlike mentality with this feeling of cheerfulness, it's kind of a good mindset to sort of like dip into every now and then, and just kind of refresh yourself, and to critique all the things that you've accepted as true, which maybe you should question a little bit more. Just as any young reader, I can speak for myself. First reading Nietzsche for the first time, like, having that kind of attitude sort of awakened. And I come back to one of the aphorisms that he has. I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil, or maybe in one of his other books. But he talks about the maturity of man, and he says the maturity of man. This means to have reacquired the seriousness that one had as a child at play. So again, like, that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, about that respect for play and for the game. And I don't know, I kind of see, sort of within this really like hard approach to life and to living, I do see something that's just very, I don't know, just nice and redeemable, and something that you should cultivate in your life. And that it can be used as a force for good and for social cohesion even. Um, but again, like, obviously, in an interpretation such as the one that I just gave, I'm ignoring a lot of things and leaving a lot of things out. And it is kind of like a idiosyncratic way of reading this in a personal way. But yeah, I do like the emphasis on war and play and all that stuff.
Yeah, look, David, I think that's a good place to end. I don't want to complicate or rebut that. I think that makes sense. I think every reading of Nietzsche requires you leaving lots of stuff out. The fascists sure as fuck left lots of stuff out of Nietzsche, like the part where he said I hate the Reich and the part where he says I disavow all anti-Semites. Like, they left that part out. So yeah, have the beautiful Nietzsche of your dreams, David, and I will too.
So I know you have you have some basketball to go watch. I have some Englishmen and cows to go hate. So I'm going to get out of here.
A true Nietzscheman, David Hill, hater of all cows and especially Englishmen. David, the people want to know, when are you going to make some more music?
I can make some anytime. I actually been playing a lot more guitar. When with like synthesizers and stuff, you always have to use, well, you don't always, but I would usually use a computer, and I'm trying to get back to just learning, analog, and using an instrument where you use your hands. So I've been playing a lot of electric guitar. Once I get good and get like down to recording some of it, I'm happy to provide you with some more stuff.
Yeah, we can do some fun stuff. I mean, people write in, they like the music. I had one guest who just, he emailed me just like, I hated listening to the interview. I sounded terrible, but oh my god, the music was great. So
That's really nice to hear. Thanks for sharing that with me. Yeah,
yeah,
one other thing. I know you talked about like pop culture and possibly like a Big Lebowski podcast, but ironically enough, one of my favorite authors, perhaps my favorite, is an Englishman, and it's Shakespeare. Have you ever thought about like doing like, I don't know, Falstaff and anarchism or something like that?
yeah. So Lear actually was the one I was going to do, and I still hope to do it someday with Larry Rue, who was the professor who taught me Shakespeare as an undergrad. We've talked about that. We haven't gotten around to it. So now I need to say that the music that you are about to hear is by my esteemed colleague, David Hill.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Graham. Take care.